in emerging market corporate debt analysis and the Claremont Institute. Um, a couple nights ago, I was flipping through late night television and I came across the movie Too Big to Fail, which of course is a dramatization of the 2008 Lehman Brothers collapse. And it's a great film. I hadn't seen it in years, and I just took a chance to rewatch it. And it's actually quite timely relative to this event because there was a moment in the movie where different officials are sitting around a table and they're lamenting the fact that US debt had risen to $10 trillion. And I kind of laughed out loud because I thought, wow, $10 trillion, that'd be nice. I mean, at the moment, the US is heading to about $35 trillion. To put that in perspective, that is 2 times China's annual GDP, 8.3% Japan's annual GDP, 8.7% Germany's annual GDP. And this is not happening in a vacuum. This is happening at a moment when China's property crisis is arguably deepening. Japan cannot figure out how to get rates away from zero. Europe is still kind of walking in place. Germany is still trying to stimulate growth again. Oil prices are rising. The Middle East is potentially in flames. Russia, Ukraine are still at it. And the US only has one AAA credit left, and Congress is working very hard to lose it. While this is all going on, somehow the US dollar is rising. So we have a great discussion for you planned today. We have a terrific speaker, Mr. David Malpass, who really needs no introduction. As we all know, former president of the World Bank. He's an alum of the Reagan administration, the George H.W. Bush administration, most recently the Trump administration, and a former Bear Stearns chief economist. And before David begins speaking, we'll also, at some point during this conversation, bring in David Goldman, who is the business editor of Asia Times, and he's also a man with a very deep CV, Credit Suisse in his background, Bank of America, Cantor Fitzgerald. He's lived around the world. And to start things off, David Malpass, we are talking about this US debt explosion and the consequences. Can you bring us up to date in terms of your thinking on the subject? And at some point during the conversation, we will do a Q&A at the end of the conversation. So there is a function at the bottom of your screen. So while we're speaking, if you have a question you'd like to plot in, please feel free. David Malpass, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Bill. Good to see you. And I want to thank Claremont Institute, also Asia Times, and David Goldman for pushing this along. I think we need a strong national dialogue on fiscal and monetary policy. I've really appreciated the work in recent months that I've been doing with Committee to Unleash Prosperity, with the Mont Pelerin Society, with Coolidge Foundation, CEI, the Competitiveness Enterprise Institute, on these topics. And I've also appreciated my affiliation with Purdue University, where what we're doing, we're striving to create what we call excellence at scale. That means more and more graduates who understand markets, finance, engineering, and technology. So with that, today I want to focus on the fiscal side. You may wonder why, because I'm truly a budgeteer. I came to Washington in 1984 as a CPA and an MBA, and I started work as an analyst with the Senate Budget Committee. I went through 2 budget cycles and 2 reconciliation bills. That was the 83-84 OBRA, and then the COBRA bill in 86. This reconciliation at that time was a novel and fast-growing part of the Washington procedures. I lived through the Gebhardt rule, the Byrd rule on germaneness, the Graham-Rudman-Hollings, and the debates over dynamic scoring. All of those are still relevant as we think about the mess that we're in. I also worked on multiple debt limit increases over the decades, both Reagan administration subsequent and then in the Trump administration. And that will be an issue in 2025 when the debt limit it comes back into effect on January 1st. When I arrived in DC, the national debt was $1.4 trillion. It had crossed $1 trillion in 1981 at the beginning of the Reagan administration. So that kind of sets the stage for our discussion today. The topic is out of control explosion of government spending, taxation, and debt, all three. It's especially dangerous now because we should be in a cyclical upturn with relatively full employment. So normally the fiscal deficit would be going down, but it's staying high, maybe even 6% of GDP. So this is completely uncharted territory, and that's what we want to talk about on the economic side today. The growth rate for the U.S. slowed to 1.6% in the first quarter at an annualized rate. And so you've got this oddity of wildly expanding national debt and shrinkage in the growth rate. I think those two go together because as private sector and especially small businesses see the government spending out of control, they cut back. So it's if you want to think in Keynesian terms, it's a multiplier that actually reduces growth rather than increasing it. Anyway, let's talk about the debt. It's the marketable debt has crossed over 100% of GDP. It's more than that if you add in the trust funds. I prefer to think in economic terms about the marketable debt. It's $28 trillion of debt, also in very rough terms, $28 trillion of GDP. So that's the 100%. If you add in the Social Security and Medicare and trust funds, you're at $35 trillion of national debt in gross terms. CBO is doing a forecast, and so a big concern for the economy and markets is the projections. Markets look forward, and so CBO is saying that our spending over the next 10 years will be at least $80 trillion. So imagine how many people it takes in Washington, D.C. to spend that money, whether they do it well or bad. It takes a lot of people to do that. $80 trillion over 10 years. Taxation is expected to bring in $60 trillion. That's under current law. President Biden has proposed in his budget big tax increases. Whether those would actually bring in more revenues is the stuff of dynamic scoring. So we can wonder, but there's CBO is scoring it at $60 trillion of taxes over the next 10 years. So a giant drain on the productive capacity of the economy. I want to make three technical points on the budget itself. First is that the trust funds, you see periodically people saying the trust funds are going to run out, they're going to reduce Social Security benefits. There's a good article in today's Wall Street Journal on page A2 that I think fully rebuts that. It makes the point that CBO, even CBO, is assuming that won't happen. So I think that the alarmist rhetoric on the Social Security payments is incorrect, that those will be paid. The question is the drain on the U.S. and the global economy from spending so much money. A second technical point is the giant generational transfer that's occurring. When the government borrows long-term, it brings forward the spending until now. So the current government gets to spend the money borrowed in 10-year, 20 or 30-year bonds from a future generation. They won't get to spend the money. So a lot of times you hear people talking about the debt service. I want to really rebut that and say it's the debt itself that is distortive to the economy. There's a second part of that generational transfer is what's going on in the full employment economy. After COVID, a lot of people didn't come back into the economy. You can call it early retirement. It's the people over 50 who felt their skills were not used. So they've left the workforce. And so they are not paying in to the economy or saving money or using their output the way they were. So that's a transfer from everybody else to people that have that could be working that have decided not to. And a third important technical point is the particularly short duration or maturity of the current national debt. As it grew, the two parts of the government decided to borrow heavily short term. That's the Treasury Department and the Federal Reserve. So the Fed borrows from banks and money market funds and puts it into bonds, and Treasury chooses the duration of its issuance and has allowed a deep inversion of the yield curve. That helps stock market prices, but it really hurts the growth of the economy, and that's showing up in the 1.6% growth from the first quarter. We saw last Wednesday, just 1 week ago, the buybacks, Treasury proposing buybacks of longer-term bonds in order to support liquidity. And we also saw the Federal Reserve saying it was going to slow down its shrinkage of its balance sheet, which means it will be borrowing more short-term than expected and dumping it into bonds more than what had been in the expectations. So both of those tend to deepen the inversion of the yield curve, which is what's happened over the last week. I have two more topics, Bill, that I'd like to mention as a starting to get us started. One is the impact on the world from what's going on. Typically in economics, you think of fiscal deficits as being a national phenomenon. And we saw that with Japan as it ran up its debt in large to well over 100% and then 150% of debt to GDP. It was financing it locally, and the size of that debt in absolute terms was not so large compared to the global economy. Japan's share of world GDP was shrinking during those years, whereas the U.S. debt, if we think about $35 trillion or $28 trillion, I think better, that is very large compared to world savings. And so the distortion, I think, needs to be noted. As the U.S. government borrows and borrows, it crowds out small businesses in the U.S., and it also crowds out investment activity in other countries. And that's what we see in the slow growth rate, global growth rate. That slowness is especially apparent if you exclude China and the US. Excluding those two, which are growing faster than average, the rest of the world has been growing very, very slowly. Europe just reported an upturn in their growth for the first quarter. It was only 0.3 non-annualized, so 1.2% at an annual rate in the first quarter for Europe, which is practically a recession and is a recession for small businesses trying to get a foothold in Europe. Okay, this is also exacerbated by the short-term nature of the borrowing of the U.S. government. Most of the rest of the world doesn't have the luxury of fixed-rate debt, so you get this huge hammer blow on countries around the world and companies and people when the floating rate goes up. That's true of much of the rest of the world's debt. Mortgages, for example, outside the U.S. are not typically fixed rate mortgages, they're floating rate mortgages. So if we think we have an affordability crisis in the U.S., which we do, it's worse abroad. Okay, the third section I wanted to mention is politics. There's a fiscal train wreck coming in 2025. That includes the debt, which the debt limit has to be raised at some point, I think in the first half of 2025. It will be intensely partisan and difficult, whoever is president. The politics of debt limits is very harsh right now. My February Wall Street Journal article discussed that problem, the fiscal train wreck. Now we've got the Biden budget proposing the big tax increases. So as we get to the election, the November election, there's going to be this huge divide in that the markets will have to examine of who wins and whether they actually carry out which parts of their tax reform. Either way, there's going to be giant tax changes in 2025 and 2026. And then third is the deficit or the spending bills themselves. They all run out, so there'll have to be a giant rethink of those. When I was the tax analyst for the Senate Budget Committee in 1985, I co-authored the tax expenditures book that's done with the Joint Tax Committee, and it lays out all the expenditures that are coming out of the tax side of the budget, and they're huge. So what the Democrats are doing is going through that book and saying, well, every one of these should reduce the expenditure, meaning increase the taxation. That's the capital gains taxes. That's the basis step up for in the estate tax. That's of course personal and corporate income tax rates and a host of others. So that's a big differential in the outlook. Okay, so on the politics, then several points. One is people talk about, well, if only we had backbone in each party, then we could tackle the budget deficit and the national debt. I don't think that's correct at all. The elected members are not responsible or are irresponsible, of course, but they are often elected by constituents who would rather have the spending than have spending restraint. No, I think it also doesn't work to talk about means-tested entitlements and trying to reduce the humanitarian or the caring expenditures in the budget. I think it also does not work, as I mentioned, using the trust funds or trying to force the issue by looking at the elderly. So that brings me to, and I've written a lot about it, the constitutional roots of the fiscal deficit. The Constitution is built on the idea of checks and balances within different parts of the government, but there's a giant vacuum with regard to the check and balance on the debt itself. The debt limit law was written in 1917 expressly to get more debt to fund World War I. And so we think we have a debt limit, but it's really misnamed. It's a debt increase process that has been done now for over 100 years and will continue under the current reading of it. And I think what you will see is more and more spending or increases, for example, the forgiveness of student loans, and also the recent proposal that's out there on Freddie Mac buying second mortgages. So you have more and more of the debt implicitly guaranteed by the government. The same is true on the state and local side with the problems in Illinois. So the good news is there would be a huge impact if the government could do anything that gave confidence that there was some kind of resolution of this overspending and overtaxation. So think how well the dollar would react, and also investment would react in the United States. The world would be looking at the US and saying, holy mackerel, that's the place to be for our new investment. So we need models and a full rethink, and I've called for an upheaval in the modeling and in the policies of the government in these areas to focus on spending growth, not so much on the deficits themselves, but it's actually the spending growth. And we need that also to be done at the state and local level, where it's right now a giant cover-up of the commitments being made on the spending outlook. So let me turn to the solution, and then I'll wrap up. What I've advocated is that we really recognize first that there's a gap in the checks and balances. It's not a matter of backbone for politicians. It's very hard to get them to vote to reduce any kinds of spending, and so they won't, and they haven't. And so there needs to be new rules. I think that rule needs to be the concept that when you're over a debt to GDP ratio, I first proposed this when we're at 50% debt to GDP. We're now at 100% debt to GDP. That's good enough for government work, meaning the markets would accept any kind of limit and welcome it if we could do it. So let's say when you're over 100% debt to GDP limit, then there's pain felt in Washington. The whole game in Washington is make the pain felt elsewhere in the country, meaning they close the national parks outside of Washington. We need to do the opposite, to have it be very uncomfortable to be in Washington when we're over the debt to GDP limit. That means, for example, that give the president line item veto or impoundment authority when we're above the limit on the debt. That would be really uncomfortable for Congress. They hate that idea. That would be a starting point. Then there needs to also be things to put pressure on the executive branch when we're over the debt to GDP limit. For example, there could be a required report to Congress monthly by the president to say what he or she is doing on the debt limit. There could be a condition that there not be COLA, cost of living increases for senior government employees, whether civil service or political, doesn't matter. They don't get COLAs when we're above the debt to GDP limit. But it's really important that it be painful for Washington, D.C. specifically, and that the country support that in order to change the dynamics. So with that, I know Bill's going to bring us some to the market implications of all this. I think they're fascinating, but I wanted to give that kind of starting point that we have giant amount of debt, that it is having a dramatic negative impact on the rest of the world as now. And from a political standpoint, don't expect Washington to fix it on its own. It's got to be new rules that bring us to better solutions. Thanks.
Sure. I mean, as you were just saying, it's hard to think of two administrations, the Trump administration and the Biden administration. It's hard to think of two governments that are more different in terms of their fiscal philosophy, if you will. If Joe Biden called you tomorrow and said, based on your deep experience, Moody's Investor Service is out there lurking, they might be downgrading the US at some point, how can I hold them off between now and the election? What would you advise the president to be doing?
Bond rating agencies and markets are really forgiving, so they want a signal. So when we saw in the Clinton administration, the triangulation that was engineered by Bob Rubin of saying, look, if I change direction that is going to be more fiscally responsible, it will be recognized. So I think there's at any point a leader can do that. Now, there doesn't seem to be any inclination in the current administration to do that. And that hints the clear differential in the election between strength versus weakness and between fiscal profligacy on the Biden. That's very clear in the Biden budget. And then Trump, we don't know what the budget would look like or what the principles, other than at least there's talk of the need for much faster growth. Can I make a point on that? Biden seems to be, they're claiming that we're doing fine on the growth rate. That if you look at the CBO forecasts out for 10 years or for 30 years, they're miserably low. And so I think that creates an opportunity for discussion. What is a normal growth rate for the United States, given the wondrous nature of our country? I think the normal growth rate for the U.S. is 2.5%, 3.5%, 4%. And especially at this point in a cycle, we should be growing much faster. So I think that has to be discussed by the Biden administration. Why are they supporting such a slow growth rate?
Okay. And this week, Stephen Mnuchin, a man you know very well, said that the rising US dollar is helpful in terms of financing US debt. However, the trade-off, I imagine, is that for a lot of developing countries, especially perhaps here in Asia, it creates other challenges. Asia doesn't tend to do very well in moments when the dollar is having something of a runaway rally. What is your take on that?
These are big questions. We have to get granular. When you look at it, the dollar has strengthened against the yen and yuan, the Chinese currency, but has not strengthened that much against the euro. So there's differential. And in fact, the dollar has weakened against gold and commodities. So from the inflation standpoint, the U.S. is having to contend with cost push inflation, coming into the economy from previous years' problems in the supply chain. So we've got this big upward ratchet in prices in the U.S. that's keeping our interest rates high. So you're exactly right. These are very real problems. Now, Japan's contended with this for decades, many decades. They intervene when they have to, and I think they're already doing that. So they're drawing a line on the value, and they don't yet have inflation and may not. So I think we could imagine a world where the yen settles where it is, where the yuan settles where it is, and where the U.S. is very attractive from an investment standpoint for most of the world. What I'm saying is that we could be more attractive. Part of this is what is normal. And so I think that under normal conditions, the US would be seeing an investment boom that would bring down inflation. And we're not seeing that. People are wait and see because of the uncertainty over the election, but also this core uncertainty over what are you going to do about your growth in government spending. There's no process right now to control or to rein in or to make logical choices within this gigantic government budget. You know, we're proposing $8 trillion per year of spending. How is that possible? And what process could be changed? Both parties seem to want to have it be large. I think we need new rules. I've said that. And back to you, Bill.
Right. So among the op-eds you've written in recent months, one has been focused on the Federal Reserve and what they could be doing to boost growth. You've kind of suggested that Chairman Powell could be doing more to use the bully pulpit in some ways to talk about, you know, basically fiscal consolidation, if you will, and that the Fed could be doing more to perhaps shrink its balance sheet. What is your latest take on what the Fed should be doing?
So right at the start, and in my articles, I've made clear the Fed needs to be independent. So this idea of them talking about the fiscal side is in extremis, meaning there has to be some nod from the world that some big part of the inflation that's been occurring is not the Fed's fault, but is the circumstances. The COVID lockdowns that went on and on, also went on and on in China, drove up some of the inflation, but then this giant government spending drove it up. And the Fed made a big mistake, by thinking that zero rates could continue. So it's a deep look back. So what I've basically said is the Fed has to be more modest in its role in the current inflation. The interest rates that we have now are not what's causing the inflation that we have now. So I would like to see less discussion of the Fed's interest rates and more discussion of the other things the Fed does, but mostly the rest of the government does on the productive side of the economy. That's all these regulations that are coming out last minute of the administration trying to get in before the wire of the election. You know, there's a big incentive for the Biden administration to issue rules now, which is what they're doing. The Federal Reserve has been pushing through a lot of regulatory policies that constrain commercial banks and their lending to small businesses. So there needs to be a rethink on that. I think they're doing that now. I was pleased to see Powell talk. He did the right amount of talking about the fiscal deficit late last year. And so I don't know that they have to raise that now. And to your point on the balance sheet, let me come to that. My strong argument for 10 years has been that the Fed should not be intervening in fiscal policy by buying bonds. When they buy bonds, it is a fiscal activity by the Federal Reserve. They borrow from banks and buy government bonds issued by the Treasury Department. And there's that never happened before 2009. That, you know, we've had this massive change in monetary policy that needs to be used very judiciously and modestly by the Fed. The change to pay interest on bank reserves and money market funds. So this is with no appropriation. So this is a giant expansion of the Fed's power, and they've used it to buy bonds, which I think is inappropriate. It was one thing to do it in the great financial crisis in 2009 and 2010. If you want to say this is a super big emergency and we're going to do this thing one time, which they kind of said they were going to do, but then they got to like it and they said, oh, let's just keep buying bonds. That has been harmful in multiple ways. I think it deeply distorts the economy toward bigness, because when you buy bonds, you're buying the debt issued by either the government or rich people, corporations, individuals that can borrow in long maturity instruments. And so that fundamentally shifted the economy away from small business and from the little guy. And we see it in all of the data. The median income just didn't grow during this period of 0% interest rates. Who got that? That went on for over a decade. Who got the benefit of that? A narrow group at the top. And that's what's causing some of the divisiveness politically now.
It's often said.
Yeah, go ahead, Bill.
To finish the point, yeah, the Fed should, I think, be looking for opportunities to reduce its holding of bonds. And now is the perfect time. Instead, last week, they announced that they're going to slow down the shrinkage of their bonds, meaning they're going to be, as their portfolio matures, they're going to be buying more and more bonds. And they've laid out this concept of a big balance sheet for the Fed. It's the opposite of what's going on in much of Europe. They're recognizing that good central banking means shrinking the size of your balance sheet when you are out of a crisis. So you see Sweden doing that. You see Germany arguing for that. But the U.S. is going the opposite of saying no. A fundamental concept of our central banking is to have a really big balance sheet permanently, which means the Fed constantly distorting markets, whether it's the off-the-run bonds, its choice of what maturity to buy, and also having this chokehold on the banking system to boot.
David Goldman, do you have something to add?
David, in terms of the politics of this, it's been a shibboleth in American politics that once you get a spending program, you can never get rid of it because too many people like to get the money. After COVID, we had, about a $6 trillion increase in transfer payments temporarily, but the whole baseline of transfer payment spending went up. So the result is everyone has more money, but no one can afford to buy anything. Is there a possibility that this money illusion or fiscal illusion that is so much a feature of the American political landscape will at some point backfire and give a government a mandate to reduce this kind of spending with its inflationary implications and deleterious consequences for households?
David Malpass?
David, are you able to hear us?
David?
We appear to have an issue. Well, when things go wrong, I guess everything goes wrong.
Well, David, let me ask you a question. When
David, do you have your sound? Can you hear us, or go ahead, Bill? Sorry.
So, David, when you look at the rest of 2024, what do you see as the biggest risk to the Asian financial systems? Is it the U.S. dollar stumbling? Is it China slowing? Is it the yen carry trade? Is it COVID coming back? What keeps you up at night the most looking forward?
Well, China has a debt to GDP ratio comparable to the United States, except it's distributed very differently because a lot of what we would consider to be state debt in the United States is counted as corporate debt in China because so much of the infrastructure spending, like the equivalent of our highway trust in the United States, is accomplished by state-owned enterprises. So China's vast infrastructure spending is counted as corporate debt, which is a much larger percentage of GDP than it is in the United States. The Chinese have made a deliberate decision to pop the bubble in the real estate market and try to force investment out of relatively low productivity, stagnant investment in property into high-tech investment. They've certainly made some progress in that. Their EVs are doing very well. Solar panels and telecom infrastructure industries are doing well, but they do run a risk that the reluctance of Chinese consumers to spend, given the reduction of their wealth through the fall in housing prices, might be a really serious drag on their economy. However, countries with enormous current account surpluses generally don't have monetary crises, because if money is coming in all the time, if you're in net surplus, basically you can rearrange the paper internally. Bill, I'm most worried about Japan, which you know much better than I do, because with its vastly aging population and declining savings rate, the population now has to begin to spend down the savings that is accumulated. It seems to me to be in a trap which is very hard to compensate for by increasing productive capacity and exports. So Japan really worries me the most of any of the Asian countries. I'm not sure how you see it, but you've written a lot about Japan, so maybe you want to
Well,
comment.
I'm paid in yen, so it's personal. We're calling it now the Japanese peso. David Malpass, are you back?
Hi,
David?
Bill. Yeah.
Oh, okay, great. There you are. So it's often said that the US has built a very impressive economy on the hill, but Asia holds the mortgage. As you know, Asian central banks hold trillions of dollars of US treasuries. And there's always a lot of speculation about whether China, Japan might begin selling their treasuries and what it means for US debt. Do you see this as an issue of Asia having leverage over the US, or is Asia kind of trapped with all of its dollars?
I am very sorry for my my technical glitch.
You're I think you're sideways right now. So
that
Yes,
there we
better?
go.
that's better.
Yes, much better. All right,
Sorry.
there you are.
So
No worries.
Asia is okay. Asia is so we have to bring in portfolio diversification. So all the central banks and even the savers in countries are constantly thinking about what their risk return is for various instruments. So I don't worry so much about who's going to buy the US treasuries. I worry more about the impact on both us and them from the issuance of treasuries. In 2023, the government issued $23 trillion of US debt. That's because they had rollover of short maturities, and they're still doing that in 2024. So as you're sitting in Asia, you're looking at a country that has its duration too short. And so that makes it hard for you. That's, I think, one of the attractiveness right now of gold. They're saying, well, gold doesn't have that problem. I'll get it no matter what. Another thing weighing on gold or weighing on the dollar is the sanctions and the talk of taking international reserves in the European markets related to Ukraine and Russia, the Russian international reserves. So the world is constantly making a choice to invest in the US or not. And right now, it's not going so strongly for the US. We should be doing much better than we are.
David, let me
And as you
reformulate
go ahead.
the question I asked before we had the technical glitch, which is, how do you see the public perception of the fiscal crisis? Are people beginning to see it affect their own lives? Are they beginning to wonder about the sustainability of previous policies? And how do you think that will shape American politics going forward?
I think people are dismissive of Washington. They know what the game is, and so that this gives it's hard to poll. If you ask people, do you care about the national debt? They'll say yes, it's horrible. If you ask them, do you think anything's going to be done about it? They say no, absolutely not. The politicians are crooks, and so if you ask them, do you want to do something about the national debt? I don't know, but I think most people would say no, because it's going to be under the current rules. When you say you're going to do something about the fiscal deficit, that just means a tax increase. Biden has been very clear on that, even this week, that the clear solution for the deficit is to tax more. So the public looks at that and says, no matter who it is, if it's a business owner, it affects the employees of the business. So we don't want to do that. So that's why it's very hard to get a real read on the public, because they know who's running the rules.
We have a number of questions from the audience. One asked by several attendees is, could this lead to a crisis of some kind? I'm summarizing many questions in one sentence, but could you see a debt crisis emerging at some point as a result of what we've all been talking about?
Yeah, I think it's possible, and then that gets into why did Jimmy Carter's crisis move from irresponsibility to a true crisis? Where, remember what happened in 1979, the U.S. government hit a nadir, a bottom point, a low point in its fiscal management by having to issue bonds in Swiss francs in order to get people to buy them. They didn't trust the dollar was weakening and nobody cared. And they were saying, well, we'll just raise rates. That will save the dollar. And it got worse and worse. And so this gets us to, it depends precisely on how the government describes its actions during a crisis. Now, having said that, we're not in a crisis now, but I am worried that this differential that's coming on the bond yields with Europe is the first round of it. Why would Europeans want a 2.5 yielding euro bond when they could have a 4.5% yielding dollar bond? Well, because they, some of them have more trust in Europe's fiscal and monetary policies than in the U.S. And I think that's wrong, but the U.S. has to be very clear right now that it will defend the dollar and it will begin to take actions that put in place a check and balance on the size of government.
Another question from the audience regards the possible response of Asian central banks to the rise in the U.S. dollar and U.S. interest rates. One listener mentions that Indonesia, for example, has 3% inflation, but has to keep interest rates very high because of the strong U.S. dollar. Could you foresee a situation where you have a mercantilist separation of foreign markets from the dollar, where with exchange controls or other measures which try to insulate economies from the negative effects of high dollar interest rates and a strong dollar?
Well, yes, but it depends on whether those are effective. Okay, so let's draw the analogy to small businesses and to high yield. The market will, if we are in a high for long environment where growth stays slow, the market will increasingly differentiate among assets. That's in the U.S. in terms of the evolving crisis in commercial real estate. And then as we look abroad, it will do the same thing for countries. The market wants to pick winners and losers. So Indonesia this was maybe smart of them or maybe too late to get ahead of the curve by reacting to the weakness of the rupiah. I don't know if people recall, but Brazil was foresighted 2 years ago when it began raising interest rates and raised them substantially prior to the U.S. getting into the game. So they looked at it and said, this is not a non-inflationary world. We better get our rates higher. And they did it. And that helped them because they got ahead of the curve. So I think you'll see this differentiation in emerging markets where some of them have a strong enough economy that they can invite capital at current rates. Others will have to raise. And then I wanted to say with regard to Japan and China, they are both very skilled at this game. So it's clear that China wants to keep the yuan stable. It's been in a relatively narrow range since 1993, and so that and in my conversations with them, they've been explicit about their desire to have the yuan be a stable currency for the world. They're trying to build market share, so I would expect them to react in that manner. And then Japan, same way. They for years have wanted the yen not to be a weak currency, not to be a strong currency. So I think a lot of what's going on is Japan and China are interacting with each other and with the Singapore dollar. They look at the Asian currencies and try to find a normal level within those rates. And then they realize the U.S. is going to be highly volatile because of the politics.
But what if that equilibrium breaks down? I mean, the yen, again, it's down 10% this year, even after the most recent intervention. Nothing would help China's economy more at the moment, arguably, than letting the Chinese currency slide to some extent. And then you have a situation where Congress swoops in, where US lawmakers, US politicians are gearing up for an election. It would make Donald Trump's head explode to see China's currency weakening. It would make Biden's head explode as well. What kind of risks should we be considering there in terms of what China might do?
Yeah, so a good outcome, if I can say that, would be if the U.S. Got its productivity going and decided that it was going to allow more productive activity within the economy. It's doing the opposite. All we're doing is puffing up the consumption side of the economy, especially government workers. And so, Asia looks at that and says, we have no way to respond to that. We don't know what we're going to do. We don't have inflation. China and Japan don't have inflation. China has even a deflation problem. And so arguably, if you were eager to move your currency, you'd go to the weaker side, which you're right, would be bad for the U.S. It makes China more competitive. So they're in a box, but really it's the U.S. is in a box. We keep stoking inflation on our side through the givebacks by the government that keeps pumping money into the economy. And so until that stops, I think we're just at an impasse. It's going to be a big fist fight with both Japan and China that they can't let their currencies go down, even though they don't really have an inflation problem. So again, I want to emphasize the proper way to handle this is for the U.S. to produce much more, and that would bring our inflation rate down. And if the government would get out of the way, that was the title of my February Wall Street Journal article, if the government would get out of the way, you would see investment boom in the U.S. and the inflation rate would fall.
David Goldman, any other good questions?
Well, the sources of financing of the debt are a really interesting question. It bears on exactly what you're saying, David. After the 2008 global financial crisis, there was an enormous increase in foreign holdings of U.S. treasuries. Certainly, central bank holdings have been static for the last several years. The Chinese have actually reduced that, which means that, per your point, domestic investors have had to replace the foreigners. So banks have increased their treasury holdings while their commercial and industrial loans have, if not declined, remained well below trend. Households and others are buying treasuries, and that reduces investment elsewhere. So I guess if we were able to reduce the rate of growth of debt, the amount of funds that would be freed up for domestic investment could be very substantial.
Yeah, yes, this is a huge dynamic environment. And so don't underestimate that. If there was any signal from the U.S. That it wanted to defend the dollar and invite investment in order to have more production in the U.S., markets would say, great, I'm all in. But that's not, I mean, we're sending all three of those the opposite signal. There's no
When
mention of the dollar, for example. In that long press conference, nothing from the Fed or from Treasury that they want to defend the dollar. So markets get the idea. Oh, you don't want to defend the dollar, and that also gives rise to the people looking at Bitcoin, or they're looking at alternative central bank currencies, and especially China is salivating over the opportunity that it has as the dollar goes out of favor.
Hey, David Goldman, do you think that 3% U.S. inflation is as good as it gets, for here on out, or do you think that a move back to 2% U.S. inflation is possible in the next couple of years?
it's very hard to calculate what inflation is. Larry Summers published a paper with some other
Fair enough.
economists arguing that if you factor in the additional cost of debt service at higher interest rates, inflation by some earlier Bureau of Labor Statistics measurement standards would have really been 18% at the peak, and that it's still 7 or 8%. So I think the perception of people who are not in the 1 or 2% at the top, that their living standard has fallen, is probably accurate. And it's alarming that Americans have increased their revolving credit, their credit card debt, so so rapidly. So I think we have a serious problem that is eroding the financial position of households and eroding living standards and creating, a great deal of popular upset. I think this will be a huge issue in politics, but since David Malpass knows a great deal more about politics than I do, I was hoping he'd say more about that.
I said a lot already. So I do want to say something about inflation. I'm not a fan of the Fed doing all of its dot charts and thinking that it knows what inflation expectations are. But there is a kernel of truth to it. Inflation expectations are very changeable. So if there's an announcement that the government will spend less and allow the private sector to spend more, the inflation expectations will go down, and indeed price increases will slow down. So we shouldn't. I really want to get us away from this fatalistic view of we're stuck with inflation because of something that was done in the past. We're having inflation now. They call it resilience or stubbornly high inflation because of what we're doing now. And that is fighting against productive forces within the economy and not defending the dollar and so on.
David, do you have any sense
David,
of where military spending will go from here? That's a question that several of our listeners have asked about. Certainly, it imposes constraints. We're in a situation in which we have several international crises that we're directly or indirectly involved in and sources of major tension. Is this a concern? Is it something that we can anticipate?
Well, I think we definitely can anticipate. We had the peace dividend in the 90s after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Soviet Union breaking up, and now we're going the opposite direction of having to have the opposite of a dividend, a big increase in investment in defense industry. It's harmful to overall growth of the economy, but it's probably necessary given the weakness to which we fell. I've been writing about the pullout of the U.S. from North Africa and the turning it over to China and to Russia. This has huge negative consequences and will require much bigger defense spending into the future. So that's bad from the economy standpoint. It's an unfortunate side effect of weakness. So then let's turn to the rest of the budget. I made the point already that the Social Security and Medicare, I expect the government to fully fund. I expect it to fully fund the defense buildup that's needed. So the CBO forecasts of spending, I think, are on the conservative side. We'll probably spend much more over those years than the $80 trillion that I cited over the next 10 years. We'll probably do more than that because of the defense buildup. Now, final point then, the efficiency of that buildup is going to be really, really important. If you waste it on Jones Act, for example, that's the law that requires the U.S. to build the ships here and doesn't differentiate between the kinds of technology, then you end up with giant wastage within all parts of the U.S. government budget. So we need to do much more with waste, fraud, and abuse. That won't solve the budget deficit, but that will at least help, and it will be a signal to people that we want a more productive economy. So as the defense buildup increases, there needs to be much more rational choice and efficient choice of expenditures where we differentiate. It's the same thing that needs to be done with China as we diversify our economy away from dependence on China. You have to pick the categories of diversification that are most important to you. So high tech, sensitive, data-oriented technology has to be moved, but some of the items in the defense budget can be purchased abroad.
Bill?
So, David, say in the months ahead, Donald Trump is reelected or elected second time, and your phone rings, and you find yourself 1 year from now in the Treasury Secretary's office. What is your pitch to global investors that the U.S. has this at hand, that this debt explosion, this debt bomb won't happen on your watch? What are your words of reassurance?
I want to deny that hypothetical. So for one, there's a huge election that has to be done. I think the terms of the election are clear. Strength versus weakness and growth versus anti-growth. But let's see how that plays out with the electorate and the electoral college, all of that. But what I know is that leadership that the Republican Party has a giant amount of leadership. It's available and would be brought in to further a mission. And so then the issue becomes the clarity of the mission to strengthen the economy and strengthen I've written about the soft power where we've been giving it away and the hard power. And so those are all within our capabilities as a nation. For the Treasury, I've spent a lot of years there now in combination. So it's let me just say how complex the task is. To do the tax reform that's needed requires a large number of really talented people, both at the Treasury Department, but then in other parts of the government and on Capitol Hill. Tax reform is, I was heavily involved in the '86 Tax Reform Act, and then more tangentially in the 2017 Trump tax reform. And these are really, really complicated tasks. You mentioned Secretary Mnuchin earlier. He did a great job, but people, I think, don't have a full comprehension of the level of detail that was needed by him and by James Baker and Dick Darman in 1986 in order to get those bills done. So that that means the modeling, that means the scoring and the interaction with the Hill. They're all really complicated. And I could go on then and take each of the tasks, whether it's how do you do sanctions and why and when, whether it's how do you change the maturity structure of the U.S. debt so it's not as risky as it is right now. We've chosen this short-term financing of the debt that's so harmful, and on down the list of problems that are out there. Bank regulatory reform, of course, is really important to growth. So there's a list. There needs to be literally hundreds of people that understand the supply side of the economy, so they can make it work. I would say the same about many of the cabinet departments, but also so that means, well, each of the cabinet departments is really important in the growth equation and in the living standards. How do we make life better for people in the United States? That involves all the departments. But I wanted to make also a mention and a plea for strength in the over the decades, the White House staff, meaning the National Security Council, the Office of Management and Budget, the National Economic Council, these are not, and a host of others are run directly out of the White House. We might not like that, but that is the world that we live in. And so having strength in those is available to the Republican Party, and I think can be built on and can do a good job. But the first order has to be, how do you win an election in this environment?
Well, the hour is basically up. David Goldman, any concluding comments or any final questions from yourself or the audience?
There's one question from the audience, which David Malpass is perhaps uniquely qualified to answer, about the decline in percentage of dollar reserves internationally. There has been a significant fall. My question is this bad for us, or is it a natural result of the maturation of the world economy where other currencies simply become available and some of the burden of a reserve currency is taken off us? How do you see that?
A big topic. One, I don't agree with the idea of a burden of the international currency. So the U.S. has the privilege of people liking the dollar and liking dollar reserves. I think the share of central banks using dollars going down is a reflection of all sorts of things. One is the availability of euros, but also I think they're counting gold, and some countries are building gold in their international reserves. It may include SDRs. This is the funny money from the IMF as part of international reserves. And now China, of course, the Chinese yuan is counted in as part of the international reserves. So part of it is just natural diversification of the global base. And then, but the harmful part is, to the extent that the U.S. is using sanctions more and more, then countries begin to not want to have dollars in their international reserves. Is it harmful to as I mentioned earlier, I don't care so much how much dollars U.S. government debt foreigners buy. The primary market is U.S. asset managers, global asset managers, and they're going to look at the growth outlook for the U.S. and the comments of whether we're defending the dollar. They can't be in a weakening currency, so you need to differentiate why should you be in the dollar versus gold? And China's making a big bet on gold, and so that's and others are looking at that and saying, boy, if they choose gold over the dollar, should we? And the answer really forcefully from the U.S. government should be, we are absolutely defending the dollar, and it will be a currency, a strong, stable currency 50 years from now. That is assured by the U.S. government. So it needs to be that forceful a statement, like what Biden did yesterday on the anti-Semitic rhetoric. He finally said very forcefully that is not our country. So we need definitive, strong statements about lots of parts of what can be done to have a strong country.
Well, David Malpass, thank you for this brilliant presentation on behalf of all of our readers. I should also like to thank the Claremont Institute, which is an important source of research and policy analysis on the issues we've been discussing. And of course, thank you to our distinguished chief financial correspondent of Asia Times, Bill Pesek.
My pleasure.
Thanks, everybody. Nice to see you all. Thanks.
Many thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
We
Be
conclude
safe
now. Thank you.
Thank you.